Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Gogol. I'm a co-founder of DeFiAM and a researcher at the University of Zurich. I work at the intersection of institutional DeFi, MEV, and Layer-2s. And today I'm going to present you a study about sandwich attacks on Layer-2 blockchains. It's a joint work together with Jan Goźny, Manvi Schneider, and Professor Claudio Tessone. Before we go to L2s, I assume you might have heard about the sandwich attack that took place around, I think, 2 weeks ago, when one of the traders using our mobile app was trying to swap 50 million worth USDT into Aave tokens. And to his big surprise, after signing that transaction, he received back only Aave tokens worth around 50,000. So simply, he lost more than 49 millions. The transaction was executed successfully. And the first actually warning that the user received was here about the extreme slippage. Because when you are trying to swap 50 millions stablecoin into some token, I mean, the slippage will be 90%. But then still, you would receive almost 5 million worth token, but he received 50,000 because later he was also sandwiched. And generally, those solvers like a car swap, they offer like a timely execution, splitting those trades into smaller ones that you can slowly execute. And that user haven't done that. So, but what is the sandwich attack? A sandwich attack is actually when the MEV searcher, some bot that is running on the blockchain, observe your upcoming transaction. For example, it see, okay, you want to exchange 50 million USDT into Aave tokens, and then this is your transaction. It's a target transaction, target swap, and simply such attacker is trying to put inside the same block the front-running transaction and back-running transaction. The front-running transaction is buying those tokens just ahead of you, increasing the price at the exchange, and later after your transaction is actually selling those tokens. And because those transactions are happening just after and before your transaction, is being called a sandwich, and they simply influate the price. Or decrease the price if you are selling, which is extremely unfavorable for you and for your transaction. However, in order for that attack to happen, a few things must take place. I mean, first of all, attacker must be able to see your transaction, that you are willing to swap 50 millions into Aave tokens. On most of the blockchains, like Ethereum, the mempool, which is like a data structure with the transactions waiting for execution, is simply public, meaning that anyone can observe those transactions. So the second thing that needs to happen as attacker, once identify his target, needs to make sure that one of his transactions will be executed before and one after that target transaction. So there needs to be a way to influence the order of transactions in a block. On Ethereum, it can be done by the builders that simply decide about order of transactions within a block. And then the third thing is those transactions should be included inside the one block. Otherwise, you have no guarantee that maybe other swaps or other attackers will place their transactions in between, and then your attack will be unprofitable or partially successful or unsuccessful, and you incur some losses. And this is the state on Ethereum. We can ask the question, what's actually happening on L2s? Because L2s are structurally different than Ethereum. The first difference is that on most of the rollups, the mempool is actually private, meaning that nobody except for the centralized sequencer cannot see the transactions waiting for execution. Also, there is no builder market, there is no MEV boost, but But all of the participants, they simply need to compete with each other about the inclusion, and they need to compete about the latency and also the height of the block. Thus, doing anything actually on the rollups is probabilistic. We don't get any guarantees that we know that they exist on Ethereum. And then there are some analytics. This is example a dashboard from Flashbots, which is showing that such sandwich attacks actually already happen on Layer-2s. Because on Layer-2s, the mempool is private. However, once the transaction is executed, it's becoming public to anyone. And we can look at those transactions after execution and simply check if there are some sandwich patterns. If there are some swaps that are surrounded by buy and sell swaps coming from the same actor. And according to some analytics, such patterns already exist on rollups. And simply what we did in our work, we look deeper into what's standing behind those patterns. And we simply check who are those attackers, what is the profit, and what strategies those attackers used in order to extract that value. Because on the L2, in order to ensure that your sandwich will be actually executed, not to even mention profitable, you need to ensure that a few things will happen. The first thing, of course, you need to make sure that the back-running transaction will happen before the front-running transaction, and the target transaction will happen in the middle. Then you also need to make sure that if you are paying the tip, then simply you can try to influence the order by the priority fee. On some rollups, they accept priority fee and they order the transactions based on the priority fee that you pay. And in such case, the priority fee of a front-running transaction, the first one should be the highest, and the priority fee paid by the back-running transaction the lowest. And the last thing is that those transactions, like front-running and back-running, they need to happen relatively close to the target transaction. It doesn't need to be the same block, especially as on Layer-2s blocks are produced every 200 milliseconds, but they need to happen ideally in the same block or within a few blocks around. And there are generally two strategies that the sandwich attackers on Layer-2s can use. The first one is simply a delay strategy, meaning they are first sending a front-running transaction, they wait a few milliseconds, and then after that they send a back-running transaction. And simply by doing that, they assume that the front-running transaction will be executed first, and the back-running transaction will be executed later. The same thing can be achieved using some smart contracts. For example, there can be some smart contract with which those front-running and back-running transactions are communicating, and simply the back-running transaction using that smart contract can check if the front-running transaction was actually already executed. But this is how actually you can, or attacker can influence order of the front and back-running transaction. Attacker still doesn't know whether there will be victim transaction or if there be any victim transaction. And this is actually where the things starts to become interesting. Because whereas on Ethereum, attacker can observe the mempool and knows there is a target. Here on the Layer-2s, because mempool is private, attacker must guess how many targets will be in the mempool and how many target transactions he can potentially attack. And by observing some patterns, for example, USDC ETH is a very liquid cryptocurrency pair. And there are in every block, even on the rollups, there are plenty of swaps that are exchanging USDC into ETH and back. And then simply by observing what is the pattern and how many of such swaps are happening in every block, sandwich attacker can predict what should be the size of the front-running and the back-running transaction and how often they should be executed. However, when we look at the all factors around Layer-2s, like the time of the block and that probability of co-inclusion, then actually probability that the attack will be successful is relatively very slow, because it's between 5 and only between 5 and 20%, meaning that to generate some significant profits, on average, in every block on L2, there should be a swap of at least $4,000. We found that simply that probabilistic strategy will be not profitable, and the attacker will incur more losses. And we simply go deeper, and we check what is the profit from the attackers today on the rollups. So we look at the major rollups like Arbitrum, Base, ZK Sync, Unichain, and we simply look at all of the sandwich patterns that are out there happening. Yeah, to identify all the patterns that are out there, we simply look at the different DEXs. We actually grouped the front-running and back-running transactions to make sure they are coming from the same actor, the same smart contract, or the same bot, if they are ordered in the same way, and if the back-running and the front-running transactions are actually opposite to each other. And actually, here you can see the results of our analysis, and you can see that actually, in most cases, there is a very big difference in sizes between the front-running and back-running transactions. And this is what we call the strong signature. It simply means that only around 5-7 on Arbitrum, 20% of those sandwich patterns, they meet the criteria that the front and back running transaction, they actually have a similar size, or they differ in size, but no more than 10%. We also compared, we also calculate actually a coefficient correlation between the victim transaction, the front and back running, and generally they are very slow. The highest correlation exists on Arbitrum, although it's still relatively low. It's below 0.5. And this simply shows that attackers, if there will be like a real sandwich attacks, it's showing that the attackers are not behaving in the optimal way. You can look for the paper that is behind that research, and in that paper we actually calculated what would be the optimal size of a front and back running transaction on Uniswap v2 and on Uniswap v3. Because when a sandwich attacker can actually observe the coming transaction, and he knows its size, he knows what's the size of the liquidity pool, or what's the distribution of the liquidity in Uniswap v3, then the attacker can actually calculate what should be the size of the front and back running transaction in order to maximize his profits. And this is clearly not happening currently on rollups. This is becoming even more visible when you look at the profits, potential profits from those sandwich patterns. Because this is very funny, but if those sandwich patterns, they would be really attacks, then they would lead to a negative profit. What we saw in the research is that typically the front and back running transactions are around maybe $500, whereas the target swap is maybe around $100, $200, and simply the profit from that attack is even not enough to cover the losses from the slippage that the attacker is incurring. And in almost all of the cases, on all of the L2s, simply sandwich patterns that exist today, they're leading to the negative return. And this is simply showing that what we see there and those transactions that everybody is suspecting to be front and back running, they must be doing something else. And here we also look at who is issuing or initializing those transactions. And actually, It turned out there are some bots that actually dominate the market, and most of those front and back running transactions, they are coming from the same bots. However, those sandwich patterns, they are extremely small portion of what those bots are doing. And when we go deeper and deeper, we simply observe that those bots are typically trading USDC against ETH. And our suspicion is that they are simply doing arbitrage. They are doing arbitrage between the Uniswap and Binance. They are executing plenty of swap transactions in every block on L2 in order to equal the price with Binance. And simply some sandwich patterns or potential sandwich attacks that we see on L2s, they are more a byproduct of that arbitrage strategies run by those bots. So the major takeaways from our study is that generally it's possible to execute sandwich attacks on L2s. However, this is a probabilistic execution, meaning that you can guess, you can assume, and in some situation, such attacks might become profitable. However, today, those sandwich attacks are not profitable. However, the reason why they are not profitable is not because they are not possible to be executed, but they are unprofitable because the swaps are too small on L2s. Like on Ethereum, a typical size of a swap is around $1,000 whereas on L2s it's much smaller. It's between 1 and 2, maybe up to 400. However, when we see more user traction coming to L2s, and those swaps becoming larger in volume, then such attacks, sandwich attacks based on the probability, they become feasible. And simply the conclusion is that the private mempool and hiding the pending transaction is actually not eliminating the MEV. It's simply creating a new way of MEV, that a stochastic or statistical MEV, where you are guessing or predicting what's going to be in the next block, and based on that you include your transaction. This is also, by the way, leading to a lot of reverted transaction, because when the bot is only guessing, then the transaction, if it's not successful, it's simply being reverted. However, gas fees on L2s are so low that those MEV bots, they can afford for that. They can afford to pay those fees for the reverted transactions. However, there is a lot of work on the rollups. For example, there is a lot of work about auctioning the block space in the rollups. There's also a work about based rollups and pre-confirmations. And simply, if in one of those decisions or design choices will be that we have a public mempool again on rollups, or when we have some auction mechanism that is simply allowing to deterministically assure that my front and back running transactions are in the same block or within the same range, then simply we will see acceleration of the sandwich attacks on L2s. Okay, and thank you for your attention. Yes, if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Yeah. Hey, Chris, great talk. Thanks so much. I have just, hypothetically speaking, let's say some arbitrager is basically checking for some off-chain signals, let's say the market condition, let's say the crypto is going to crash or it's going to go up, and then we should expect something happening on chain. And some products, some rollups, they also allow you to prioritize some transactions. And then leveraging this information of some off-chain signals, do you think that it could somehow be profitable for these arbitrageurs conducting some MEVs? And have you observed some correlation when, let's say, some time period where you have best MEVs, let's say arbitrage profit, whether this is correlated with some off-chain signal, let's say market condition or something like that?
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. This is a very good question. What I see so far is that the block, that there is a value in a block. Our block is having the value, meaning the order of a transaction is having the increased value, and there is more and more attempts to extract it. And what actually some of the attackers are trying to do, because mempool is private on Layer-2s, they are simply trying to see the transactions that maybe will be coming from MetaMask, or they will be coming from another providers, another wallets, where you can see the mempool or the pending transaction before it comes to the private mempool of L2. So there is a value in it, and people are trying to extract it. Maybe.
Hey, thanks for the talk. Just a question on the efficiency of mechanisms like time boost. It's a question I've never figured out. Like, in the end, would a first come first serve plus time boost be better than priority fees on L2s, or do you think that it's still to be decided?
Yes, that's actually excellent question, and the short answer is yes. I mean, generally the priority fee auctions doesn't work on L2s. So generally also make sure that before you pay priority fee, make sure that actually it really influence the order of transactions, because a lot of bots, a lot of users pay it, whereas the rollups are first come, first serve. And also with the introduction of the flash blocks and making blocks much faster, like going to 200 milliseconds or even less, then the impact of the priority fee is becoming less and less important. And also that impact is simply not executable, meaning there is a need for the proper auctions, like a time booster, for example. Okay, then thank you.